"Mom, are you enjoying the $5,000 a month?" Those were the words my son asked me at our family Christmas party, and in that single moment, the warmth of the holiday seemed to disappear from the room. 1 second, I was smiling as grandchildren ran through the living room in matching red pajamas. Christmas music played softly from hidden speakers, and the scent of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh pine drifted through the air. The next second, I felt as though the floor beneath me had shifted. Ryan wrapped his arm around my shoulders as he asked the question, grinning like he had just told a harmless joke. Around us, crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandelier, and guests laughed near the fireplace. Nobody else seemed to realize that something had just gone terribly wrong. I looked up at my son. At 38, Ryan had become everything his father once dreamed he would be. Successful, respected, wealthy, the owner of a technology company that seemed to grow larger every year. I was proud of him. I had always been proud of him. Even during the difficult years after my husband passed away, when the house felt too quiet and the future felt uncertain, thinking about Ryan's success brought me comfort. But now I stared at him, confused. "What money?" I asked quietly. His smile faded. Only slightly at first, then completely. The room around us continued moving as if nothing had happened. Someone carried a tray of desserts into the dining room. A child laughed somewhere near the staircase. Christmas lights reflected in the large windows overlooking the snowy backyard. Yet all I could hear was the silence between my son and me. "The $5,000, Ryan said. "The monthly transfer. I've been sending it for 2 years. 2 years. The number echoed inside my head. I blinked slowly. "Ryan," I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." For the first time, I noticed Nicole standing only a few feet away. My daughter-in-law had been speaking with a group of guests moments earlier. Now she stood perfectly still. One hand rested against her wine glass. The smile she had been wearing was gone. If I hadn't been looking directly at her, I might have missed it. That tiny flicker of panic. Ryan laughed nervously. "Mom, come on." He pulled out his phone. "You don't have to pretend. I just wanted to know if everything's been helping." Pretend. The word stung more than I expected. Because there had been no pretending in my life these past 2 years. There had only been sacrifice, careful budgeting, long nights staring at unpaid bills, decisions no 70-year-old woman should have to make after spending a lifetime working hard. My furnace had broken during one of the coldest winters on record. I had postponed repairs for weeks. My old sedan needed maintenance I couldn't afford. More than once, I stood in a grocery store aisle calculating prices down to the last dollar. Not because I enjoyed being frugal, because I had no choice. Ryan unlocked his phone and opened a series of banking records. "See," he said, $5,000. Every month. I stared at the screen. Date after date. Transfer after transfer. Thousands of dollars moving somewhere month after month. My chest tightened, because I knew with absolute certainty that none of it had ever reached me. "Ryan," I whispered, "I swear to you, I have never received any of that money." The color drained from his face. Slowly, almost instinctively, his eyes shifted away from me and landed on Nicole. And for the first time that evening, my daughter-in-law looked genuinely afraid. Ryan continued staring at Nicole while the sounds of Christmas carried on around us. Someone started another holiday song in the living room. Glasses clinked. Children raced past the hallway carrying candy canes and laughing. It felt strange that the world could remain so normal when my own had suddenly shifted. Nicole recovered first. She forced a small laugh and stepped closer. "There has to be some misunderstanding," she said. "Maybe the transfers were connected to a different account." Her voice sounded calm, but I noticed how tightly she held her glass. Ryan looked down at his phone again. "There cannot be a different account," he said quietly. "The account information came directly from the paperwork." I had rarely seen my son uncertain. Ryan was the kind of man who solved problems for a living. His company managed complicated projects worth millions of dollars. Yet now he looked like a little boy trying to understand something that made no sense. I placed my hand gently on his arm. "Honey, I am telling you the truth." The concern in his eyes deepened. Before he could respond, another group of guests approached, pulling him into conversation. The moment broke apart. Nicole immediately volunteered to help in the kitchen and disappeared through the dining room doorway. I watched her leave. Something about the speed of her exit settled heavily in my chest. An hour later, I drove home through light snowfall. The roads were quiet. Christmas lights glowed from neighborhood windows. Most people were spending the evening surrounded by family. I should have felt grateful. Instead, I felt exhausted. My small house greeted me with silence. I hung my coat beside the door and stood for a moment in the darkness before turning on the kitchen light. The room looked exactly as it always did. The same worn table, the same coffee maker, the same stack of unopened coupons near the counter. Yet everything felt different now. I made myself a cup of tea and sat alone. My thoughts drifted backward through the past 2 years. After my husband died, I learned how expensive loneliness could be. Not emotionally at first. Financially, every bill that had once been shared became mine alone. Property taxes increased. Insurance premiums climbed. Utility costs seemed to rise every season. I adjusted. That is what people of my generation do. We adjust. When my refrigerator stopped working, I delayed replacing it. When my water heater failed, I used savings I had hoped would last much longer. Some months were harder than others. There were evenings when I spread my bills across the table and calculated numbers over and over again, searching for ways to make everything fit. I never told Ryan. Not because I was ashamed, because I did not want to become another responsibility in his busy life. Whenever we spoke, he sounded tired. Business trips, investor meetings, conferences in different cities. Nicole often answered his phone when I called. Sometimes she would tell me he was unavailable. Sometimes she would promise he would call back. Often he never did. At the time, I assumed life had simply pulled us in different directions. Sitting there that Christmas night, I began remembering details that once seemed insignificant. Birthday cards that never arrived. Invitations that somehow got lost. Messages that went unanswered. Small moments. Tiny disappointments. Nothing serious enough to question. Nothing obvious enough to challenge. Yet when placed together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. I stared into my tea until it grew cold. Somewhere after midnight, my phone vibrated on the table. A text message from Ryan appeared on the screen. It contained only one sentence. "Mom, I am going to find out what happened." I read those words several times. Then I looked out the window at the falling snow. For the first time that evening, I realized the missing money might not be the biggest secret waiting to be uncovered. The next morning I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak that came with an older home settling into the cold December air. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window watching a thin layer of snow cover the backyard. Ryan's message lingered in my thoughts. I am going to find out what happened. It was a simple sentence, but something about it felt different. Determined. Focused. For years I had watched my son solve problems that seemed impossible. He built a company from a small office and a handful of clients into a business that employed hundreds of people. If anyone could uncover the truth, it was Ryan. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang. His name appeared on the screen. "Mom," he said immediately after I answered. His voice sounded tired. I barely slept. Neither did I admitted. There was a long pause. "I spoke with Nicole this morning." I sat down at the kitchen table. And another pause. "She says there was probably an administrative mistake somewhere along the way." I looked at the stack of bills sitting beside the fruit bowl. "Do you believe that?" He did not answer right away. I do not know what to believe anymore. Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. Throughout the day, I found myself revisiting old memories. Not major events. Small moments. The kind people normally dismiss. 3 years earlier, Ryan had promised to visit for my birthday. The morning of the celebration, Nicole called and explained that an urgent business matter had come up. Ryan never arrived. A year later, I mailed photographs from a family reunion. Ryan never mentioned receiving them. Last spring, I left 3 voice messages asking about a weekend lunch. None were returned. At the time, I blamed timing. Schedules. Busy lives. Now I wondered whether those explanations had simply been easier to accept. Late that afternoon, my phone rang again. This time, Ryan sounded different. Sharper. More alert. "Mom," he said. I contacted my accountant. My stomach tightened. What did he say? Every transfer went through exactly as instructed. I closed my eyes. Then where did it go? That is what I am trying to determine. I could hear papers moving in the background. Keyboard clicks. The familiar sounds of someone working through a problem. The account information on file does not match any account you currently use. I gripped the edge of the table. It never has. Silence filled the line. Then Ryan spoke softly. "I know." For the first time since Christmas, I heard something in his voice that sounded like guilt. Not because he had done anything wrong intentionally, because he was beginning to realize how much of my life he had not seen. Before ending the call, he told me he was requesting additional records, bank authorizations, transfer histories, internal communications. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. That evening, I opened an old photo album. Inside were pictures from years ago. Ryan at 10 years old holding a fishing rod beside his father. Ryan graduating from college. Ryan smiling on his wedding day while Nicole stood beside him. I studied those photographs for a long time. Families do not fall apart all at once. They drift. Quietly. Gradually. One missed conversation. One misunderstanding. One unseen barrier at a time. As darkness settled outside, another message arrived from Ryan. This one was shorter than the first. Only 5 words. Something is very wrong here. And for the first time, I realized he was no longer investigating missing money. He was investigating the possibility that someone had been controlling our relationship for years. The following week moved slowly. Every morning I expected a phone call from Ryan, and every evening I found myself wondering how much he had discovered. I tried to keep my routine unchanged. I watered the plants near the kitchen window. I walked to the mailbox each afternoon. I made simple dinners and watched the local news before bed. Yet beneath those ordinary moments, something had shifted. For years I had accepted distance as an unfortunate part of life. Now I was beginning to question whether that distance had been carefully constructed. 3 days after our last conversation, Ryan called again. This time his voice carried a level of seriousness that immediately made my stomach tighten. "Mom, I found something." I sat down in my living room chair. "What is it?" The account that received the transfers was updated about 2 years ago. I frowned. Updated by who? There was a brief silence. That is the problem. The authorization was submitted electronically using information connected to our household records. My heart began to beat faster. "Ryan, I am still verifying everything," he interrupted gently. "I do not want to make accusations until I know exactly what happened." After we ended the call, I walked through my house thinking about the timeline. 2 years earlier, the same period when communication with Ryan had become noticeably less frequent. The same period when birthday calls started arriving late. The same period when invitations seemed to disappear. At first the memories came one at a time. Then they arrived in waves. I remembered calling Ryan on Mother's Day and reaching Nicole instead. She had cheerfully informed me they were spending the weekend out of town. Months later, I learned from social media that they had actually hosted a gathering only 20 miles away. I remembered mailing Christmas gifts to my grandchildren and hearing weeks later that the packages never arrived. I remembered sending Ryan a handwritten letter after a medical appointment that left me worried about my health. He never mentioned receiving it. At the time, I assumed he had been busy. Now I wondered whether he had ever seen it at all. 2 days later, Ryan arrived unexpectedly at my front door. When I opened it, I was startled by how tired he looked. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. His usually polished appearance had been replaced by the look of someone who had spent too many nights chasing answers. We sat at the kitchen table. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Finally, he slid a folder across the table. Inside were printed emails, transfer records, and communication logs. "I hired an independent financial investigator," he said quietly. I looked up. "You hired someone?" He nodded. "I needed information from someone with no personal connection to any of us." I slowly turned the pages. Dates, transactions, notes, records stretching back nearly 2 years. The investigator had already identified multiple inconsistencies. Contact information had been changed. Notifications had been redirected. Several account settings had been modified without my knowledge. Ryan rubbed his forehead. "Mom, every answer is creating 3 new questions." I could hear the frustration in his voice. Not anger. Not yet. Frustration. The kind that comes when reality refuses to match what you believed for years. I closed the folder and looked at my son. For the first time since Christmas, I saw something else in his expression. Regret. Not over the money. Over time. Lost phone calls. Missed visits. Forgotten moments. Things no bank statement could measure. Outside, snow drifted gently across the yard. Inside, the truth was beginning to take shape. And although neither of us said it aloud, we both understood the same thing. Whatever had happened was far bigger than a missing monthly payment. After Ryan left that afternoon, I sat alone at the kitchen table and looked at the folder for a long time. The papers inside represented facts, dates, and transactions, but they also represented something far more personal. Every page seemed connected to a memory. Every record seemed attached to a moment I could never get back. The following morning, Ryan called before 8 o'clock. His voice was calm, but I could tell he had not stopped working. The investigator completed another review, he said. We found where most of the money went. I closed my eyes. Part of me had been preparing for those words. Another part had hoped we were somehow mistaken. Tell me. There was a brief pause. The transfers were redirected into accounts connected to Nicole. The room became very quiet. Outside, a snowplow moved slowly down the street. Inside, I stared at the steam rising from my coffee mug. For several seconds I said nothing. Are you sure? I finally asked. Yes. His answer came immediately. Every transaction leads back to accounts she controlled. I placed the mug down carefully. Not because I was shocked. Strangely, the shock had already begun fading days earlier. What remained was sadness. Deep sadness. Ryan continued speaking. The investigator had traced nearly every payment. Some money had been moved between multiple accounts. Some had been used for purchases. Some had been transferred again. The exact details were still being reviewed, but one fact was now impossible to ignore. The money never came to me. It never even came close. That afternoon, I walked through my house thinking about the past 2 years. I remembered postponing dental work because the cost felt impossible. I remembered patching an old winter coat instead of replacing it. I remembered standing in a pharmacy comparing prices and deciding which items could wait until next month. During all that time, help had supposedly been arriving every month. Help that never reached me. Later that evening, Ryan called again. This time he sounded different. Less confused. More hurt. Mom, he said quietly, there is something else. My stomach tightened. What is it? The investigator found emails. I waited. Dozens of them. He explained that many messages had been intercepted or redirected. Some had been deleted before reaching him. Others had been answered without his knowledge. Several communications that he believed had come directly from me appeared to have originated elsewhere. I leaned back slowly. In my chair. Suddenly, countless memories began connecting together. The missed invitations. The unanswered letters. The strange misunderstandings. The growing distance neither of us could fully explain. Ryan, I said softly. Do you remember when I asked you to visit after my medical tests? Silence filled the line. I never received that message. My eyes closed. I know. He let out a long breath. And I found one where you invited us for Thanksgiving. I never saw it either. Neither of us spoke for several moments. We did not need to. The truth was slowly assembling itself piece by piece. This had never been only about money. The money had simply exposed everything else. Years of conversations that never happened. Visits that never occurred. Opportunities lost before either of us even knew they existed. Before ending the call, Ryan told me he planned to meet with the investigator again the following day. There were still records to review and questions to answer. But the direction of the investigation was now clear. Someone had not only taken financial support meant for me. Someone had also positioned themselves between a mother and her son. After the call ended, I stood near the living room window and watched snow fall beneath the streetlights. For years I believed time had simply carried Ryan away from me. Now I was beginning to understand something much more painful. Time had not pulled us apart on its own. Someone had been quietly helping it along. The next several days passed in a strange silence. Ryan remained focused on the investigation, while I tried to keep my mind occupied with ordinary tasks. I cleaned closets that did not need cleaning. I reorganized kitchen drawers. I sorted old photographs into albums. Anything to keep from thinking too much. Yet no matter what I did, my thoughts always returned to the same question. Why? Not why someone would take money. People have made poor choices for countless reasons throughout history. What I could not understand was why someone would interfere with relationships. Why place distance between family members who loved each other? One afternoon, Ryan called and asked if he could stop by after work. When he arrived, he carried another folder. This one looked thicker than the previous one. We sat at the kitchen table where so many important conversations had taken place over the years. Ryan opened the folder slowly. The investigator completed the communication review, he said. I could immediately tell this report bothered him more than the financial records. What did they find? I asked. He took a deep breath. There were dozens of messages that never reached me. My chest tightened. How many? More than I expected. He handed me several printed pages. I scanned them carefully. Some were copies of emails I remembered sending. Others were records of text messages. There were invitations, updates, family photographs, and simple notes asking how he was doing. Messages I had written with love. Messages I had assumed were ignored. Ryan looked down at the table. Mom, I never saw most of these. I nodded slowly. I figured that out. He rubbed his forehead. Do you remember when you invited us for your 70th birthday dinner? I smiled sadly. Of course. I never received that invitation. The memory came back immediately. I had spent 2 days preparing food. I had set the dining room table for family. At the last minute, Nicole had called and explained that Ryan had a scheduling conflict. I had accepted the explanation without question. Now the memory felt different. Ryan turned another page. And this one. It was a message I had sent after spending 2 nights in the hospital for observation several years earlier. Nothing life-threatening. Just a health concern my doctor wanted to monitor. I remember writing that, I said quietly. Ryan swallowed hard. I never knew about it. For several moments, neither of us spoke. The weight of lost years seemed to fill the room. Then Ryan showed me another section of the report. The investigator had identified patterns. Messages forwarded through alternate accounts. Notifications disabled. Contact information altered. None of it looked dramatic when viewed individually. But together they formed a clear picture. Someone had not simply redirected money. Someone had controlled information. Ryan leaned back in his chair and stared toward the window. I keep replaying the last few years in my head. His voice sounded tired. I thought you were pulling away from me. I looked at my son. And I thought you were pulling away from me. The sadness in his expression nearly broke my heart. 2 people. The same misunderstanding. Repeated year after year. Built on information neither of us knew was missing. As evening approached, Ryan gathered the papers and prepared to leave. Before reaching the door, he stopped. There is one more meeting scheduled with the investigator, he said. They believe they have enough documentation now. I nodded. Enough for what? He looked at me carefully. Enough to show exactly how everything happened. After he left, I stood by the front window watching his car disappear down the street. For the first time since Christmas, I felt something new. Not relief. Not happiness. Clarity. The truth was no longer hiding behind questions. It was moving steadily toward the surface, and very soon all of us would be forced to face it. 3 days later, Ryan called and asked if I would meet him at his office. The request surprised me. During all the years he had built his company, I had only visited the headquarters twice. When I arrived that afternoon, his assistant escorted me to a private conference room overlooking the city. Winter sunlight reflected off nearby buildings, casting long shadows across the polished table. Ryan was already there. So was the investigator. Several folders sat neatly arranged in front of them. The moment I entered, I knew something important had happened. Ryan stood and hugged me. It was the kind of hug I had missed for years. Not rushed, not distracted, just genuine. We sat down together, and the investigator began walking us through the final report. Page by page, the timeline unfolded. Account modifications, communication changes, redirected notifications, deleted messages, altered contact preferences. Every action had a date attached to it. Every date fit into a pattern. What struck me most was how ordinary each individual step appeared. No dramatic event, no obvious warning sign. Just a long series of small decisions that gradually changed the flow of information between people. The investigator explained that many of the changes had occurred during periods when Ryan was traveling extensively for business. Notifications were disabled. Contact details were adjusted. Messages were filtered. Opportunities for direct communication became increasingly limited. Ryan listened quietly. Occasionally, he asked a question. Occasionally, he closed his eyes and rubbed his forehead. The investigator eventually placed a final document on the table. This summarizes our findings, he said. Based on the records available, there is no indication that Mrs. Parker ever received the financial support that was intended for her. There is also substantial evidence showing that communication between mother and son was repeatedly interrupted over an extended period. Hearing those words spoken aloud affected me differently than I expected. I thought I would feel anger. Instead, I felt tired. Tired for the years that had been lost. Tired for the misunderstandings neither Ryan nor I had caused. Tired for all the moments that could never be recovered. After the investigator left the room, neither of us spoke immediately. Ryan stared out the window. Finally, he turned toward me. Mom, I owe you an apology. I shook my head gently. You did not know. I should have known. His voice cracked slightly. I should have paid more attention. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. We both trusted people we loved. The room fell silent again. Sometimes there are no perfect words, only honest ones. Ryan nodded slowly. Then he opened another folder. Inside were copies of photographs, family gatherings, birthday parties, holiday celebrations, school events involving my grandchildren, moments I had missed. As we looked through them together, Ryan began pointing out dates, certain events I had never been invited to, certain occasions where he believed I had declined. The realization settled over both of us at the same time. Entire chapters of our family history had unfolded while each of us believed the other had chosen not to participate. By the end of the meeting, the winter sun had nearly disappeared behind the skyline. Ryan carefully gathered the documents and placed them back into the folders. His expression had changed. The confusion that had dominated the past few weeks was gone. In its place stood certainty. The facts were no longer disputed. The evidence no longer incomplete. For the first time since Christmas, there were no major questions left unanswered. There was only one thing remaining. The truth now existed in black and white. And very soon, everyone in the family would have to confront it. The family gathering took place the following Saturday at Ryan's house. It was not advertised as a confrontation. In fact, most relatives believed it was simply an opportunity to spend time together after the holidays. The living room looked warm and inviting. A fire burned in the stone fireplace. Family photographs lined the shelves. Children played upstairs while adults gathered downstairs with coffee and desserts. Yet beneath the ordinary atmosphere, there was a tension I could feel the moment I walked through the door. Ryan greeted me immediately. His expression was calm, focused. He no longer looked confused. He looked prepared. Nicole was already there. She smiled when she saw me, but the smile never reached her eyes. Over the past few weeks, something had changed. She seemed aware that the truth was moving closer. Family members slowly settled into seats around the living room. Conversations faded. Ryan stood near the fireplace and thanked everyone for coming. Then he placed a thick folder on the coffee table. The room grew noticeably quieter. Nicole shifted slightly in her chair. Ryan began speaking in the same measured voice he used during business presentations. No accusations. No raised voices. Just facts. He explained how the investigation had started. He described the missing financial transfers. He summarized the independent review. Then he opened the folder. One by one, he presented the records. Bank transfers, account histories, communication logs, timeline reports. Everything organized by date. Everything documented. Nobody interrupted him. The room remained silent except for the turning of pages. At first, Nicole attempted to explain certain discrepancies. She suggested technical mistakes, administrative errors, miscommunications. But each explanation was followed by another document, another record, another verified timeline. The more evidence appeared, the fewer words she offered. I sat quietly throughout the entire discussion. I did not need to defend myself. The documents spoke clearly enough. More painful than the financial records were the communication reports. Ryan showed copies of messages I had sent, but he never received. Invitations, birthday notes, family updates, medical news, photographs, evidence of years spent trying to stay connected. Several relatives looked visibly shaken as they reviewed the material. One of Ryan's cousins wiped tears from her eyes after reading a message I had written years earlier inviting the family to Thanksgiving dinner. A dinner Ryan never knew had been planned. Ryan eventually reached the final section of the report. The room became completely still. The investigator's summary outlined a pattern extending across multiple years. Financial support redirected away from its intended recipient. Communication repeatedly interrupted. Family relationships affected by information that never arrived where it was supposed to go. When Ryan finished speaking, he closed the folder and placed both hands on the table. No one spoke for several seconds. Then Ryan turned toward me. "Mom," he said softly, "I am sorry for every moment I believed you chose distance when you were trying to stay close." My throat tightened, not because of the apology itself, because I knew how difficult it was for him to say those words in front of everyone. I reached over and squeezed his hand. Across the room, Nicole sat quietly. The confidence she once carried had disappeared. There was no dramatic argument, no shouting, no scene, just silence. Sometimes silence says more than anger ever could. As the afternoon continued, relatives approached me one by one. Some apologized for assumptions they had made. Others simply hugged me. For the first time in years, I felt seen. Not because of the missing money, not because of the investigation, because the truth was finally visible. And as I looked around the room, I realized something important. The investigation had uncovered far more than financial records. It had uncovered the reality of what had happened to our family. And now that reality could no longer be hidden. Several months passed after that gathering. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and for the first time in years, my life felt lighter. Not perfect, not magically repaired, but lighter. The investigation was finished. The facts had been established. The questions that had haunted us for so long finally had answers. Ryan and I began rebuilding something that neither of us realized had been damaged so deeply. Every Sunday morning he called. Not because of an obligation, not because of guilt, because he genuinely wanted to talk. Sometimes we discussed business. Sometimes we talked about gardening, old family memories, or whatever happened to be on our minds. The conversations were simple, but they mattered. One afternoon he arrived at my house, carrying a toolbox. The porch steps had become loose over the winter, and before I could say a word, he was already kneeling beside them making repairs. I stood at the doorway watching him work. For a brief moment, I saw the little boy who used to follow his father around the house asking questions about every project. Some things had changed over the years. Some things never really do. As trust slowly returned, other parts of life improved as well. My grandchildren began visiting more often. They helped me plant flowers in the backyard and spent afternoons listening to stories about their grandfather. Family photographs that had once represented painful absences started becoming reminders of new memories instead. Healing happened gradually, quietly, the way most important things happen. One evening, Ryan and I sat on the back patio watching the sunset. The air was warm, and the sky glowed orange above the trees. After several minutes of silence, he looked at me and asked a question that had clearly been on his mind for a long time. "Mom, are you angry?" I thought about the question carefully before answering. "I was hurt," I said. "Very hurt." He nodded. "I understand." I looked out across the yard. "But anger is heavy." I carried enough weight already. Neither of us spoke for a while after that. The birds settled into the trees as daylight faded. Finally, Ryan smiled. "You always find a way to see things differently." I laughed softly. "That comes with age." The truth was that I had spent many nights thinking about everything that happened. The missing money mattered. Of course it did. $120,000 could have changed many things. It could have eased financial stress. It could have prevented years of unnecessary worry. But as time passed, I realized that money was never the greatest loss. Money can be earned again. Savings can be rebuilt. What hurt most were the missed birthdays, the unanswered messages, the family dinners that never happened, and the ordinary moments that disappeared forever because two people believed the other had chosen distance. Those years could never be returned. Yet sitting there beside my son, I also understood something else. The future had not been stolen. We still had time. Time to talk. Time to laugh. Time to create new memories that belonged to us instead of the past. As darkness settled across the yard, Ryan stood and helped me gather the empty coffee cups. We walked back toward the house together. For years I believed I had lost my son little by little. Now I understood the truth. I had never lost him at all. We had simply been separated by lies neither of us could see. And in the end, the most valuable thing we recovered was never the money. It was each other.